If you're an older man and you're wondering whether the younger woman in your life is actually interested in you, this video walks you through the 7 questions she's quietly asking herself about you, not out loud, not directly, but in the small moments you might be missing entirely because you're too busy trying to say the right thing to notice what's actually being tested. Picture this. It's not going to be a checklist she hands you. She's going to run a series of silent tests. Most of them in the first few conversations, and how you show up in those tests will matter more than anything you say on purpose. And later I'll show you why the men who try hardest to seem impressive are usually the ones who fail these questions the fastest, while the ones who aren't performing at all tend to pass without even realizing they were being evaluated. If you want to actually understand what's happening beneath the surface here, type steady in the comments and let's get into it. You already know the feeling of misreading a moment. You're having a good conversation, it feels easy, and then a week goes by and no clear signal either way, and you're left replaying the exchange, trying to reverse engineer meaning out of a laugh, a text reply time, the way she looked at you when you made a joke, small fragments of evidence that never quite add up to a conclusion no matter how many times you turn them over. Older men in particular tend to either overread every gesture as significant or dismiss every gesture as nothing, and both mistakes come from the same root problem. You're guessing, because nobody ever taught you what to actually look for. That guessing costs you something: real clarity, confidence, and a lot of wasted energy spent decoding instead of simply being present. There's an added layer for older men specifically, and it's worth naming directly instead of dancing around it. When there's a meaningful age gap, a lot of men quietly assume the dynamic must be about something external: stability, resources, status, the things an older man is statistically more likely to have accumulated by a certain point in life. That assumption does real damage because it puts you in a defensive posture before the relationship has even started, constantly wondering whether her interest is genuine or transactional, second-guessing warmth as if it might be strategy. Some men respond to that suspicion by overcompensating, trying to prove their value through display: the car, the restaurant, the story about the deal that closed, as if attraction were a resume review, a competition to be won through the right combination of visible assets. Others swing the opposite direction, becoming so worried about seeming like that guy that they undersell themselves entirely, treating every compliment she gives as suspicious rather than simply receiving it, deflecting genuine warmth because accepting it feels too exposed. Neither response comes from confidence, both come from the same anxious guessing game, just pointed in opposite directions. Epictetus had a blunt way of framing this kind of uncertainty. He said that what disturbs people isn't events themselves, but the stories they tell about those events. And nowhere does that show up more than in the anxious guessing game of "does she like me? And if she does, why?" You're not actually reacting to what's happening. You're reacting to your interpretation of what's happening, and that interpretation is very often wrong in ways you can't see from the inside, colored by insecurities that have nothing to do with her at all, and everything to do with stories you've been telling yourself for years, possibly decades, about what you do or don't deserve. There's also a specific cost that compounds over time if this pattern goes unaddressed. Every relationship you enter while still running this anxious guessing game gets built on a foundation of interpretation instead of observation, which means you're never actually responding to her, you're responding to your theory about her, and theories, unlike people, tend to confirm whatever bias you brought into them. A man convinced she's only interested in his stability will interpret her every warm gesture as transactional. A man convinced he's too old, too unimpressive, too far past his prime will interpret her every warm gesture as pity or confusion. Neither man is actually seeing her. Both are seeing a projection built from old wounds that have nothing to do with the woman sitting across from them. Here's the core idea for this video, and it's simpler than the guessing game makes it feel. A younger woman who's genuinely interested in an older man isn't testing your wealth, your status, or your ability to impress her. She's testing your character, specifically the parts of your character that only show up when you're not performing. Now here's what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean age gaps are simple, or that every younger woman's interest is identical, or that you should treat this like a manipulation framework designed to get a result out of someone. That's the opposite of what's useful here, and it's the opposite of what actually works. It also doesn't mean resources or stability don't matter at all. Of course, a degree of security matters to most people building a life with someone at any age, but security is table stakes, not the actual differentiator. And treating it as the main event is exactly where a lot of older men get the whole approach backwards, spending their energy proving something that was never actually in question in the first place. What this idea opposes is the very common, very modern instinct among men, especially men who've had success in other areas of life, to assume that attraction is earned the same way a promotion is earned, through visible achievement, through resume building, through impressive display. It isn't. Younger women, more often than older men expect, are quietly far more attuned to consistency, presence, and emotional steadiness than they are to any external marker of status. Think about it from her side for a moment. She's likely met plenty of men who lead with their achievements, who narrate their success like a pitch, who seem to be auditioning for a role rather than actually showing up as a person. That approach might generate initial interest, but it rarely generates trust. And trust is the actual currency this whole thing runs on, especially once the novelty of the first few conversations wears off. There's also a generational piece worth naming honestly. Younger women today have generally grown up with more exposure to conversations about emotional health, boundaries, and attachment patterns than previous generations did at the same age, simply because those conversations are more widely available now than they were decades ago. That means the specific behaviors this video is describing, genuine listening, emotional steadiness, comfort with vulnerability, aren't abstract or old-fashioned virtues to her. They're often things she has actual language for, has discussed with friends, has learned to recognize the absence of in prior relationships. An older man who assumes his life experience alone gives him an edge in this particular arena is often working with an outdated map, because the terrain of what actually signals emotional maturity has shifted, and it rewards exactly the qualities this video keeps returning to. Let's go through exactly what she's silently asking, starting with the simplest question and ending with the one that determines whether this becomes something real or quietly fades. The first question she's asking is whether you actually listen or whether you're just waiting for your turn to talk. Picture a dinner where you ask about her work, and 30 seconds into her answer, your mind is already assembling your next sentence, a story of your own, a piece of advice, a redirect back to something about you, instead of actually tracking what she's saying, instead of noticing the specific details she just offered that a genuinely curious follow-up question would naturally pick up on. She notices. Not because she's suspicious, but because genuine listening has a specific texture, and its absence is obvious the moment you compare it to the real thing. There's a particular kind of question that gives this away almost instantly, the follow-up question. Anyone can ask the first question in a conversation. It's easy, it's expected, it barely requires attention at all. But the second question, the one that only makes sense if you actually absorbed her first answer, is much harder to fake. Men who are performing interest ask a lot of first questions. Men who are genuinely interested ask a lot of second ones. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the discipline of giving your full attention to whoever is in front of you, treating the conversation itself as the entire task, not a delay before your own turn arrives. He was famous for practicing this even in moments where his mind was clearly elsewhere, running an empire, managing wars, drowning in obligations, and he specifically noted in his own private writing how easy it was to let his attention drift while appearing to listen, and how deliberately he had to work against that drift, catching himself mid-conversation more often than he would have liked to admit. If an emperor with the weight of Rome on his shoulders considered full presence worth the effort, it's a reasonable bar for a dinner conversation. There's a well-documented concept in psychology called active listening, and one of its core findings is that people can reliably sense the difference between someone listening to respond and someone listening to understand, often within a single exchange, even when they can't articulate exactly what tipped them off. Researchers who study conversational engagement point to specific, almost involuntary cues: eye contact that doesn't drift toward phones or other distractions, questions that build directly on what was just said rather than pivoting to a new topic, small verbal and nonverbal confirmations that show tracking rather than waiting. None of this is about performing attentiveness, it's about actually having it, because the performed version tends to fall apart under any real scrutiny. The reframe: you don't need better stories or sharper opinions to seem more interesting. You need to actually be present for hers, because presence reads as far more attractive than performance ever does, and it's also conveniently much harder to fake for an extended period of time, which is exactly why it functions as such a reliable signal. Action for today: in your next real conversation, resist the urge to plan your response while she's still talking, and notice how much more you actually retain, and notice too how much better your own responses get once they're built on what she actually said instead of what you'd already decided to say. There's a version of this that's specific to conversations across a meaningful age gap, and it's worth calling out directly. A lot of older men, often unconsciously, treat conversations with younger women as an opportunity to mentor, to advise, to share accumulated wisdom whether or not it was requested. It comes from a genuine place. You've lived more, you've made more mistakes, you have context she doesn't have yet but delivered unprompted. It turns a conversation into a lecture, and a lecture is the opposite of listening, no matter how good the advice actually is. The goal isn't to withhold what you know, it's to let her ask for it, or to earn the opening for it through genuine back and forth, rather than assuming your years automatically grant you the floor. The second question, and this one is quieter but far more revealing, is how you treat people who can't do anything for you. Picture a restaurant where the server gets an order slightly wrong, or a bit of small talk with a stranger who has no relevance to either of your lives, a cashier, a parking attendant, someone you'll never see again, someone whose good opinion of you will never once translate into anything you need. She's watching, whether she means to or not, because this is the moment where your real character shows up unfiltered, with nothing at stake and no audience worth performing for. This matters more with an age gap than it might in a relationship between peers, precisely because a younger woman dating an older man is often, consciously or not, trying to predict what he'll be like decades from now, when the initial charm has worn thin and the daily texture of the relationship is all that's left. How you treat someone with zero social leverage over you is one of the most efficient previews of that future available to her. Seneca made a sharp distinction between the behavior people display when they think they're being evaluated and the behavior that shows up when they think nobody's watching, arguing that only the second one tells you anything true about a person. He wrote extensively about the households he observed among wealthy Romans, noting how differently men of supposed virtue treated their household slaves compared to their dinner guests, and treating that gap as the most honest available measurement of a person's actual character, far more honest than anything performed for an audience of equals. The principle transfers directly. Anyone can be charming to the person they're trying to win over. The real information is in every interaction that isn't being observed by the person whose opinion matters. This connects to a well-known concept sometimes called the waiter rule, an informal but widely observed pattern where how someone treats service staff correlates strongly with how they'll eventually treat a partner once the initial performance period of a relationship wears off. It's not a formal psychological theory in the academic sense, but it tracks with something more established: the idea that behavior under low accountability is generally a better predictor of character than behavior under high accountability, since high accountability behavior is by definition shaped by the awareness of being judged. A man who's warm to a server because he genuinely respects people, not because someone important is watching, is showing you behavior that will likely hold steady once the relationship stops feeling new. The reframe: being polished in front of her isn't the test. Being decent when you think it doesn't count is, and the gap between those two versions of yourself, if there is one, is exactly what she's quietly measuring, whether either of you ever says so out loud. Action: the next time you're out today, pay close attention to how you treat someone who has zero ability to affect your life, and let that be the version of you she actually gets to see, not because you're performing for her benefit, but because it's simply who you are, tested or not. There's a longer-term version of this worth naming too. Plenty of men manage a decent version of themselves for the first several months of a new relationship simply because the relationship is still novel and still feels worth the effort of good behavior. The waiter test matters precisely because it strips away the novelty factor early. A man who's decent to strangers when there's genuinely nothing to gain isn't drawing on the temporary motivation of trying to impress someone new. He's drawing on something more durable, something that isn't going to fade once the relationship stops feeling new to him. That durability is exactly what she's trying to distinguish from the performance, because the performance, however convincing, always has an expiration date. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If she watched an unedited recording of how you treated every stranger you interacted with this past week, would you actually be proud of what she saw, or would there be a few moments you'd quietly want cut from the footage? The third question is sharper, because it targets something men often fake without realizing they're faking it. Is your confidence real, or is it a performance you're maintaining because you think it's required? Picture a moment where something doesn't go your way in front of her, a reservation falls through, a plan gets disrupted, a joke lands flat, and watch what happens to your mood. Real confidence barely flinches at minor disruptions because it isn't dependent on things going smoothly. Performed confidence is fragile, and fragile things crack the moment they're actually tested, usually in small, almost invisible ways: a slightly too fast recovery, an overcorrection, a joke that's trying too hard to prove nothing's wrong, an irritability that surfaces disproportionate to the actual inconvenience. There's a particular version of this that shows up often with older men specifically, and it's worth naming directly. The confidence that was built entirely in a professional context, a boardroom, a job site, a domain where you're genuinely the authority doesn't automatically transfer to a romantic or social context, and pretending it does often produces exactly the brittleness this question is testing for. A man who's used to being deferred to at work can find it genuinely destabilizing to be in a dynamic where nobody owes him that deference by default, and how he handles that adjustment tells her a great deal. Epictetus separated what's within your control from what isn't, and true confidence in his framework comes specifically from mastering the first category so thoroughly that the second category stops being able to rattle you. He taught this to students who arrived expecting philosophy to be abstract, and instead found themselves practicing something closer to a daily discipline, noticing, in real time, which of their reactions were actually justified by the situation and which were just habitual overreactions to things that had never been within their power to control in the first place, things as ordinary as weather, traffic, or someone else's passing mood. There's a concept in psychology called self-efficacy, genuine belief in your own competence, built through actual accumulated experience, and it looks completely different from the confidence built on social approval, which is entirely dependent on maintaining a specific image and collapses the instant that image is threatened. Self-efficacy tends to be domain-specific and earned slowly through repeated evidence of actually handling things well, which is precisely why it doesn't shatter over a single bad night. There's too much accumulated evidence underneath it for one disruption to overturn. There's a related idea worth mentioning here, sometimes described in terms of internal versus external validation loops. A man running on an internal loop checks in with his own sense of whether he handled a moment well. A man running on an external loop checks her face, her tone, her reaction to determine whether the moment went fine, essentially outsourcing his own emotional temperature to her in real time. The second pattern is exhausting for both people because it puts her in the position of constantly managing his emotional state without ever being asked to take on that job. And most people, consciously or not, start pulling away from relationships that quietly demand that kind of ongoing labor. The reframe. You don't need to seem unbothered by everything. You need to actually be steady enough that small disruptions don't require a performance to cover for them, which is a very different, much lower effort state to maintain than constant composure. Action. The next time a plan falls through around her today, resist the urge to overcompensate and just let the moment be what it is, mildly annoying, quickly resolved, not a referendum on your competence. There's a specific variant of this worth watching for because it's easy to miss in yourself, the joke that's working too hard. Men who feel destabilized by a small disruption often reach for humor to smooth it over, which sounds harmless, even charming on the surface. But there's a noticeable difference between humor that flows naturally from an unbothered mood and humor that's clearly trying to redirect attention away from a moment of discomfort. The first kind lands easily and doesn't need anything from her in return. The second kind, even when it gets a genuine laugh, tends to leave a faint residue of effort behind it. She can often sense that the joke was doing work, covering for something, rather than simply being funny for its own sake. Here's the counterintuitive part, and it's worth slowing down for. Most advice tells men to project more confidence, more control, more polish around women they're interested in. The actual test running underneath all of that is whether you can drop the polish entirely and still hold steady, which is a completely different skill, and most performed confidence collapses the instant it's asked to do that. The men who understand this stop trying to manage her impression of them in the moment and simply focus on staying grounded regardless of what impression results, which paradoxically produces a far better impression than the management ever could. The fourth question is one most men never even consider. She's asking, does he have an actual life of his own, or is he quietly looking for someone to fill a void he hasn't dealt with? Picture the difference between a man who talks about his friends, his projects, his interests, his own forward motion trips he's planning, skills he's picking up, people he genuinely enjoys spending time with, and a man whose entire emotional weather seems to depend on how the relationship is going, who gets noticeably lighter or heavier depending entirely on her mood and her availability. The second version is exhausting to be around even when nobody says so directly, because it puts the entire emotional load of the relationship onto her shoulders before it's even become a relationship. This question carries extra weight in an age gap dynamic, and it's worth being honest about why. An older man is statistically more likely to be navigating a divorce, an empty nest, a career winding down, or some other major life transition that leaves a genuine gap where structure and companionship used to be. There's nothing shameful in that. Transitions happen to everyone eventually. But there's a real difference between a man who has done the work of rebuilding a full life around that transition and a man who's simply looking for a person to plug into the hole the transition left behind. She can usually tell the difference within a few weeks, sometimes within a few conversations, because the second version tends to move fast, get intense quickly, and treat her presence as a solution rather than an addition to an already full life. Seneca warned repeatedly against building your entire sense of well-being around something external to yourself, arguing that anything you depend on completely for your peace of mind ends up owning you rather than the reverse. He wrote this partly from personal experience, having watched wealthy, successful Romans around him structure their entire emotional stability around things, status, relationships, possessions that could be taken away at any moment, leaving them devastated the instant those external supports shifted, sometimes over losses that from the outside looked relatively minor. His answer wasn't to stop caring about people or things, it was to make sure your foundation didn't depend entirely on any one of them holding steady. This connects to attachment theory, specifically to what's often described as anxious attachment, a pattern where a person's sense of security becomes so tied to a partner's presence and reassurance that ordinary distance starts to feel like a threat, which most people can sense in someone else even before they can name it. Attachment researchers have long noted that this pattern isn't fixed for life. People can and do shift toward more secure patterns over time, particularly through self-awareness and deliberate effort, but it tends to show up early and clearly in how someone handles distance, uncertainty, and their partner's independent life outside the relationship. The reframe, having a full life outside of her, isn't distance, it's the actual foundation that makes closeness sustainable instead of suffocating. And it's also, not incidentally, far more attractive than the alternative, because nobody wants to feel like the only thing holding another person's life together. Action. This week, invest visible time into something entirely your own, a project, a friendship, a hobby, anything with its own momentum completely separate from her, and notice how it changes the texture of your interactions, how much lighter your attention feels when it isn't the only thing keeping you afloat. Pay attention too to the pace question, because it's closely related and often the first visible symptom of this dynamic. A man filling a void tends to move fast, wanting to see her constantly, wanting labels and certainty earlier than the relationship has actually earned, treating early enthusiasm as proof this is different from anything before, rather than letting time do the work of actually finding out. A man with a full life tends to move at a pace that feels natural rather than urgent, because he's not counting on this particular relationship to solve a problem his life currently has. Speed itself isn't the tell. Some genuine connections do move quickly. The tell is whether the speed is coming from excitement about her specifically, or relief at finally having something to fill the space that opened up when the rest of his life changed. The fifth question gets into genuinely uncomfortable territory, and it's one a lot of men fail without ever finding out they failed it. Can you actually handle it when she disagrees with you? Picture a disagreement over something small, a restaurant choice, a difference of opinion about a movie, a gentle pushback on something you said, and watch your own reaction closely. Does a flicker of defensiveness show up? Does the conversation subtly shift toward you needing to be right, needing the last word, needing her to concede before the tension can fully dissolve? Maybe you notice yourself repeating your point a second time, slightly louder or slightly more elaborated, as though she simply hadn't understood it correctly the first time, rather than genuinely seeing it differently. There's a specific version of this that tends to show up with older men, built up over years of being the senior person in most rooms. They occupy the boss, the experienced one, the person whose opinion usually carries the most weight by default. That dynamic can quietly train a man to expect a certain deference without ever consciously deciding he wanted it, and a younger woman who pushes back on something isn't being disrespectful when she does, she's simply not operating inside that hierarchy, and how a man responds to that absence of automatic deference is one of the clearest character tests on this entire list. A younger woman evaluating an older man is often watching specifically for this, because it previews exactly what conflict will look like years down the road, when the stakes are much higher than a restaurant choice, a disagreement about finances, about family, about a major life decision neither of you saw coming. If small disagreements already trigger defensiveness, there's no reason to expect the large ones will go any better. And she knows that instinctively, even if she's never articulated in exactly those terms. Marcus Aurelius practiced treating disagreement as useful information rather than a threat to be neutralized, actively inviting correction from people around him because he understood that being wrong and finding out mattered more than being seen as right. He wrote to himself about specific advisors who challenged him, framing their willingness to disagree as one of the more valuable things they offered him, precisely because so few people were willing to risk his displeasure by doing it, and he seemed to recognize how easily that silence could have calcified into an emperor who never heard an honest word again. An emperor of all people had every structural incentive to surround himself with agreement, and he deliberately worked against that incentive because he recognized what it would cost him in the long run. There's a concept called cognitive dissonance that's directly relevant here. The discomfort that arises when new information conflicts with your existing self-image, and the two most common responses to that discomfort are genuinely updating your view or defensively rejecting the new information to protect your ego, and people can usually tell within a few disagreements which pattern you default to. The defensive response often isn't even conscious. It can show up as a subtle change in tone, a slightly clipped reply, a need to explain yourself at greater length than the moment actually calls for. All small tells that the ego has been activated even when the words themselves stay polite. The reframe, losing a small disagreement gracefully, isn't weakness. It's proof that your sense of self doesn't require winning every exchange to stay intact. And that kind of security is exactly what makes a woman feel safe bringing you real disagreements later, instead of quietly avoiding them to keep the peace. Action. The next time she disagrees with you about something minor, practice simply saying that's fair and meaning it. Even if part of you still privately disagrees, you're not required to actually change your mind just to let the disagreement exist without needing to win it. It's worth being honest about what's actually at stake if this pattern goes unaddressed. A relationship where one person consistently defers to avoid triggering the other's defensiveness isn't peaceful, it's managed. She learns, often without deciding to, which topics are safe to raise and which ones require careful phrasing to avoid a reaction. And that quiet self-editing accumulates the same way every pattern on this list accumulates, slowly, invisibly, until one day the relationship feels distant and neither person can point to a single moment that caused it. The willingness to lose a small argument today is really a down payment on her willingness to stay honest with you years from now when the disagreements carry real weight. If you've made it this far, you already think about this more carefully than most men do. Your 5 questions in. And instead of looking for tactics, you're actually examining your own patterns, which already puts you ahead of almost everyone searching for advice on this topic, most of whom are looking for a script rather than an honest look at themselves. So do one thing for me right now, hit like on this video, because it's the clearest way to make sure this reaches another man who's been guessing instead of understanding, the same way you might have been guessing before this video started. And that thread from the very beginning about why the men trying hardest to impress usually fail the fastest is about to make complete sense, because questions 6 and 7 are exactly where that pattern becomes impossible to miss and where everything you've just heard finally clicks into a single idea. Let's keep going. The 6th question is one of the most important on this list, and it's rarely discussed directly. Does being around you make her feel safe enough to be fully herself, including the parts of her that aren't polished, impressive, or camera ready? Picture a moment where she says something a little insecure, a little unfiltered, a little less put together than her usual presentation, an anxious thought, an unflattering story about herself, a moment of genuine uncertainty about her career or her future, or something she's not proud of, and pay close attention to how you respond. Do you meet it with warmth and curiosity, or does some part of you subtly recoil, or rush to fix it, or make it about your own reaction instead of simply holding space for hers? This matters in a specific way for older men, because a common but rarely discussed dynamic is the instinct to slip into a fixer or advisor role the moment vulnerability appears, treating her uncertainty as a problem to be solved with your accumulated experience rather than a moment to simply be present for. That instinct usually comes from a good place. You've lived longer, you've likely navigated similar feelings yourself, and offering a solution feels like care. But it often lands as something closer to being managed than being heard. And there's a meaningful difference between a partner and an advisor, one that becomes very apparent the moment vulnerability shows up and gets met with a fix instead of an ear. Epictetus taught that you should judge your own character by how you treat people in their weakest, least composed moments, not their strongest ones, because anyone can be gracious when someone's already impressive. The real test is what happens when they're not. He built much of his teaching around this exact idea, arguing that composure in the face of someone else's struggle, without judgment and without needing to immediately resolve it, was one of the clearest markers of genuine character available, far more telling than how someone behaved when everything was already going smoothly. There's a well-documented psychological concept called emotional safety, closely tied to research on secure attachment, describing the specific felt sense that a person can express vulnerability without being judged, dismissed, or punished for it, and its presence or absence in a relationship's early stages predicts an enormous amount about how that relationship eventually unfolds. Researchers studying secure attachment have found that this felt sense often gets built through very small, repeated moments, not grand gestures, but consistent, low-key responses to vulnerability that communicate over and over that it's safe to keep showing up honestly. The reframe, your job isn't to keep her impressed, it's to become a place she doesn't have to perform for. And that shift, more than any other single factor, is what separates something temporary from something that actually lasts. Because impressiveness has a ceiling and eventually plateaus, while safety keeps compounding the longer it holds. Action. The next time she shares something unfiltered or insecure with you, resist the urge to fix it or minimize it, and simply let her know you're glad she told you nothing more elaborate than that, because elaborate is usually where the instinct to fix sneaks back in. Some men, uncertain about their footing in a relationship with a younger partner, respond to her vulnerability by trying to prove they're not too old for the moment, matching her energy in a way that feels slightly performed, or overcorrecting into a kind of exaggerated youthfulness that doesn't actually match who they are. That read is almost always wrong. What creates safety isn't a man trying to seem younger or more relatable than he actually is. It's a man who's simply comfortable enough in his own skin, at whatever age he actually is, that her vulnerability doesn't require him to shift into a different version of himself to meet it. And now, the seventh question, the sharpest one, the one that determines almost everything else on this list retroactively, and the one that finally resolves what I promised you at the very beginning of this video. Here's the paradox. Every question so far might make it sound like the goal is to become impressively steady, impressively confident, impressively secure, essentially, to arrive at some finished, polished version of yourself that passes every test on this list without effort. That's exactly the trap that causes the men trying hardest to fail the fastest, because they treat this entire list as a performance to master rather than a direction to keep walking in. And a younger woman evaluating an older man can sense the difference between the two almost immediately, even if she can't name what she's sensing. Think about why this specific trap catches older men more often than younger ones. A younger man is usually still visibly, obviously in progress, building a career, figuring out who he is, clearly not a finished product, and nobody expects him to be. Least of all himself. An older man carries a different set of assumptions, both from others and from himself. By a certain age, there's an unspoken expectation that you've arrived somewhere, that the building phase is largely over, that what you present now is close to a finished version of who you're going to be. That assumption is exactly what quietly kills attraction, because a woman evaluating this dynamic isn't looking for a finished product. She's looking for evidence that you're still someone worth watching unfold. The seventh question she's actually asking underneath all six of the others is this: is he still becoming someone, or has he already quietly given up on growth and settled into whoever he currently is as a permanent, finished identity? This is the loop I promised to close. A man who stopped growing radiates a specific, unmistakable stillness, not the calm, grounded stillness of someone secure in himself, but the stagnant stillness of someone who stopped asking questions about his own life, stopped taking risks on himself, stopped being curious about who he could still become. Younger women, often without being able to articulate exactly why, are drawn toward forward motion and repelled by stagnation, even when the stagnant version presents as more outwardly composed, more polished, more impressive on paper. This is why the men trying hardest to impress fail the fastest. Trying hardest to impress is, definitionally, an attempt to prove you've already arrived, to showcase a finished, polished version of yourself as evidence that there's nothing left to build. It's the opposite move from what actually works. The performance says, look at what I've already become. What actually lands says, watch what I'm still becoming. And those two messages produce entirely different reactions, even when the underlying man is objectively accomplished by any external measure. Marcus Aurelius, in his 60s running an empire, was still writing to himself every single night about how to become a slightly better version of the man he already was, not because he doubted his worth, but because he understood that growth wasn't a phase you graduate out of once you reach a certain age or a certain level of success. His private journal, the one that eventually became known as Meditations, wasn't written by a man congratulating himself on having arrived. It was written by a man at the height of his power, still actively correcting himself, still noting where he'd fallen short that day, still treating his own character as an unfinished project worth continued attention decades into a life most people would have considered complete by any reasonable standard, worth more, if anything, at that stage than at any earlier point in his